Welcome to the Essential Podcast, your daily dive into the topics that shape our world. Tune in daily for the essential conversations you need to hear.
Okay, so ready to dive into some serious global power plays.
Yeah.
We're talking about South Africa and their kind of tricky relationship with BRICS. If you're thinking, oh yeah, BRICS, that's just those five countries, not anymore.
Yeah. It's actually pretty amazing when you think about how much BRICS has broadened its reach. I mean, it used to be just Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. But now they've added Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, the UAE, and even Ethiopia. That's a huge shift in global power. And it puts South Africa in a really, really interesting position.
Yeah, it's kind of like, when you're trying to figure out where you stand in your friend group. That's South Africa with BRICS, but way more intense. They want to be non-aligned. This is not picking sides in global conflicts.
Right, like trying to stay friends with everyone while your two best friends are fighting, which is tricky, especially since South Africa's gotten flack for being a little too friendly with Russia lately, especially with everything going on in Ukraine.
Yeah, and one analysis we were looking at even called them controversial bedfellows. Ouch. Yeah,
That's kind of rough.
it is.
See, that's what makes all of this so fascinating, even if you don't follow global politics super closely. Imagine trying to balance your values and all your different relationships when literally the whole world is watching. That's South Africa right now.
It is, and I think it's something a lot of countries are grappling with as these global power dynamics shift.
Totally.
And this tension was totally on display at that 2023 BRICS summit, which, remember, South Africa hosted. So on the one hand, they were able to kind of flex a little bit, show how much power they actually have within the group, show they weren't afraid to oppose the West, especially on the issue of Russia.
Yeah, they basically said, we're going to make our own decisions. Thank you very much.
Exactly.
But then it got even more, complicated. Remember that whole thing with Putin and the International Criminal Court?
Oh, yeah.
The arrest warrant?
Yeah. Yeah, that was, talk about international drama.
For real. South Africa had to walk a very fine line there, trying to keep their commitments to the International Criminal Court, but also not wreck things with Russia.
Definitely a defining moment for them. Okay, but get ready for this, because things are about to get even more interesting. So, right after that summit, South Africa had their elections.
Oh, yeah.
And the whole political landscape there,
Yeah.
major shakeup.
It was huge, and it's actually really important for understanding where South Africa might be going with BRICS in the future. So for the first time ever, the ruling party, the African National Congress, the ANC,
Right.
they lost their majority in parliament. It's like the whole political ground shifted under everyone's feet.
Big time. It's kind of like, I don't know, when your favorite band breaks up and suddenly you're like, wait, what am I supposed to listen to now?
Exactly.
So what happened? Did a completely new party take over?
Not exactly. What happened is they ended up having to form a coalition government with the Democratic Alliance, which they tend to lean more towards the West, ideologically speaking. Yeah, so it's like, when you have to do a group project, but you and your classmates have totally different ideas about how to do it? That's the dynamic we're looking at right now.
Oh, I can totally see that.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got this new coalition government. They're trying to figure out how to work together. And on top of all of that, they've got this major BRICS summit coming up.
In Russia.
In Russia. Talk about pressure.
Oh, yeah. And it gets even more complicated when you remember that the ANC, even though they don't have the majority anymore, they still have some really important positions within the government.
Like what?
Well, like foreign relations and defense?
Oh, wow. So they've still got a lot of say in how South Africa interacts with BRICS.
Exactly. Exactly. But now they have to think about the other members of the coalition who might have very different ideas about how South Africa should position itself within BRICS, especially when it comes to,
Russia.
Russia. Exactly.
Yeah. It's like they're trying to manage a friendship, but with a whole new set of priorities. And the whole world's watching to see how they handle it.
Yeah, and this isn't just, some abstract political game, right?
Right.
This stuff matters. Like, the outcomes of this BRICS summit could affect everything from, global security to, how much you pay for groceries.
It's all connected.
It's all connected.
Okay, so no pressure, South Africa, just the whole future of, the global order is riding on you.
Right.
But seriously, this BRICS summit, huge turning point for them. Are they going to stick with their old allies, even if it ruffles some feathers with the West?
Or are we going to see a real change in their foreign policy? Something that could honestly totally change BRICS as we know it. That's the big question.
It really is. So what does this all mean for, for you listening right now? Like, keep your eye on South Africa. Seriously. They are walking this crazy tightrope between, like, their history and their future. And how they decide to play their hand within BRICS. It could have a real impact on all of our lives. It's a fascinating case study in how, like, a country's internal politics and these big global power dynamics all kind of crash together.
Yeah, and here's something else to think about as you're watching all of this play out. If South Africa, a country with, such deep ties to BRICS, if they're reconsidering their alliances, what does that mean for how, like, global partnerships might work in the future? Could we see other countries starting to rethink their own allegiances in this world that's changing so fast?
It's a lot.
Yeah.
It just goes to show you the world of global politics, it's rarely simple. It's full of these complicated relationships, tough choices.
Yeah.
And, a few unexpected plot twists along the way.
Definitely.
And sometimes the decisions that matter most, they aren't made in, some big fancy room full of powerful people. They're made in the in-between spaces, in that tricky balancing act of, diplomacy and strategy.
Exactly.
And as we're seeing with South Africa and BRICS, those decisions, they can have ripple effects. Effects that, that we all feel. For weeks now, I've been, like, kind of side-eyeing my wall sockets, just waiting for the lights to go out.
Right.
But they haven't Eskom and load shedding, or rather the lack of it. It feels strange, right?
Yeah.
So we're digging into this article from the Star, trying to figure out, is this for real? Or are we all about to be plunged back into darkness?
It's a really valid question, and this article really digs into all the different perspectives swirling around this sudden reprieve.
Okay.
What's fascinating is that even former Eskom CEO Mashila Koko is weighing in.
Right.
And he seems to be giving Eskom a thumbs up this time around.
Okay, so Mashila Koko, former CEO, wasn't he at the helm during that other period back in, like, 2015?
Yes.
When load shedding was also a distant memory?
Exactly. 2015 to 2018, to be precise.
Okay.
And this is what makes his take so interesting.
Right.
He is speaking from a place of experience.
Yeah.
Having faced similar skepticism during his own tenure. Back then, it was all whispers of diesel-guzzling solutions and hidden agendas.
So it's like deja vu all over again. Except this time, it's not just the former CEO singing Eskom's praises.
Right.
The article also mentioned Eskom's current chairperson, Tito Nyati.
Right, and Nyati is adamant that this isn't some election year magic trick.
Right.
With the elections looming, you can bet everyone's a little suspicious of any sudden improvements, right?
Yeah.
It's like clockwork. Elections near potholes disappear.
Well, tell me about it.
For about 5 minutes.
I swear last election, they repaved my entire street, and then Pothole Palooza returned the week after.
Exactly. But Nyati insists that this load-shedding reprieve is different.
Okay.
He's quoted in the article saying that Eskom is purely focused on sorting out South Africa's challenges.
Okay.
They are crediting structural changes and internal improvements for this positive trend.
And they've got the minister and the presidency for electricity backing them up, right?
Right.
The article mentioned Dr. Gosiansho Ramogopa, and he seems to be attributing the improved performance to a reduction in unplanned capacity loss.
Yes.
Now, for those of us who don't speak fluent Eskom, what does that even mean?
Good point. It can feel like its own language sometimes.
Basically, unplanned capacity loss refers to those unexpected outages, breakdowns, and glitches that take power stations offline without warning.
Right.
They're a major contributor to load shedding.
So when the minister says that they've clocked back 1,000 milliW compared to last year, are they saying they've somehow found a way to generate an extra 1,000 milliW out of thin air?
Not exactly. Clocking back in this context means they've managed to reduce those unplanned outages and keep more generating units online.
Okay.
Imagine it like this. You have a fleet of delivery trucks.
Right.
But some are always breaking down, delaying deliveries.
Okay.
Now imagine you've improved maintenance and fewer trucks are breaking down. You can deliver more efficiently, right?
Okay, that makes sense. But hold on. The article also mentions something about Eskom burning diesel at all costs to keep the lights on.
Isn't that like the opposite of sustainable?
You've hit on a key point there, and it's something that even the former CEO Koko is drawing attention to.
Right.
He faced similar accusations during his time that he was just throwing diesel at the problem to make it go away temporarily.
And he's calling those past accusations conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
It's like some things never change right.
Hmm.
Whenever there's a sudden shift, especially with a history like Eskom's, people are going to be skeptical.
Yeah, it speaks to the deep well of mistrust that's built up over the years. You
Right.
can't blame people for being wary.
No.
Think about it. How many times have we been promised an end to load shedding only to have those hopes dashed when the lights go out again?
It's that feeling when your car, which is notorious for breaking down, suddenly starts running smoothly. You're happy, but also in the back of your mind, you're just waiting for the engine to sputter out.
Right.
It makes you think, is this real progress or just another temporary fix?
That's the million rand question, isn't it? And this is where the article gets really interesting. Because while it doesn't give us all the answers,
Yeah.
it does offer some serious food for thought.
It's like we're all Eskom detectives now looking for clues, right? I mean, the article did mention that we've had over 40 days without load shedding. That's unheard of. But is it sustainable?
That's the million rand question, isn't it? 40 days is a fantastic start, no doubt. But we need to look deeper about what's driving this change. Is it those internal improvements Yanni mentioned? Or are we just seeing the impact of expensive short-term measures?
Like that burning diesel at all cost situation, I can't imagine that's good for Eskom's budget or the environment for that matter.
You're right to be cautious. Diesel is a quick fix, a Band-Aid on a much larger wound. It might keep the lights on for a while, but it's not a long-term solution. And remember, even if they are using diesel, the article also highlighted that Eskom claims to have reduced unplanned capacity loss.
Right, that clocking back 1,000 WW thing. So which is it? Are they just throwing money at the problem or are they actually making progress on those deeper systemic issues?
That's the puzzle we're trying to solve. If we look back at Coco's time, he faced those same accusations that he was relying too heavily on diesel, that the reprieve wouldn't last. He even called those accusations racist in the article, adding another layer of complexity to this whole situation.
It's like everyone's got their own theory, their own interpretation of what this all means. Some are hopeful, some are skeptical, and some are still clinging to their backup generators just in case.
And that's perfectly understandable. Years of load shedding have taught us to be cautious. But here's the thing, this time does feel different, doesn't it? Maybe it's that we have both Eskom's current leadership and a former CEO seemingly on the same page about the progress being made, or maybe it's the specific details the article provides those numbers about reduced capacity loss.
It's true, those concrete figures do make you wonder. It's one thing to say we're making progress, but it's quite another to put actual numbers to it. But then again, I still remember that time they promised no more load shedding, and then bam, stage 6 hit us out of nowhere.
Lives. I think we all have those Eskom never forgets moments seared into our memories. But let's play devil's advocate for a moment. Let's say for the sake of argument that this reprieve is the real deal, that Eskom has actually turned a corner.
Okay, let's say they have. Then what?
Then we've got a whole new set of questions to consider, and the article touches on a crucial one: sustainability. Even if they've managed to stabilize the grid for... Now, what about the long term? What about renewable energy? What about the aging infrastructure?
So it's not just about keeping the lights on today. It's about making sure they stay on tomorrow and the day after that, and, well, you get the picture.
Yeah.
But the article kind of skimmed over the whole renewable energy thing.
Mm-hmm.
Did it mention any specifics about Eskom's plans in that department?
It did touch on it, but you're right, not in great detail. That said, it did highlight something crucial Coco mentioned: the return to service of Coburg Unit 2 and Medupi Unit 4.
Right. Those were mentioned as factors that could contribute to a more sustained reprieve. But are those not just more of the same, more big power plants?
Yeah.
What about the whole shift towards wind and solar and all that?
It's a bit of a double-edged sword, isn't it?
Yeah.
On the one hand, we need those big projects like Coburg and Medupi to stabilize the grid now.
Right.
But on the other hand, you're absolutely right. The long-term solution has to involve a much bigger focus on renewables.
It's almost like we need to be walking and chewing gum at the same time,
Yeah.
fixing the immediate issues while also building towards a more sustainable future. But how do you even begin that kind of massive energy transition? I mean, where does Eskom even start?
It's a monumental task, no doubt. But the article does hint at some potential starting points. Remember that reduction in unplanned capacity loss we talked about?
Yeah.
Well, a big part of that comes down to maintenance, to making sure those aging power plants are running as efficiently as possible.
Yeah, so keep the old reliable, hopefully chugging along while building the new and improved. It makes sense, but easier said than done right. There's always that lingering fear. What happens when the next big outage hits? Or when those diesel reserves run dry?
That's the thing about Eskom, isn't it? It's this constant push and pull between hope and skepticism.
Right.
We need to believe that this time is different, that they've finally cracked the code. But then that little voice in the back of our heads pipes up, reminding us of all the times we've been let down before.
It's like being a South African in a nutshell, isn't it?
Yeah.
You're a nation of eternal optimists with backup generators at the ready, just in case.
So true. But even with all the uncertainties, even with the skepticism, there's something about this moment that feels different just a little bit. Maybe it's those 40 days of blissful, load-shedding-free darkness. Or maybe it's the fact that, for once, both the current and a former Eskom CEO seem to be singing from the same hymn sheet.
You've got a point. Maybe, just maybe, this is the start of a brighter, more electrified future.
Or at the very least, a future with fewer interruptions to our baking schedules.
Now, that's something I think we can all get behind. Well, on that note of cautious optimism, we'll have to leave it there for today. But one thing's for sure, the Eskom saga continues, and we'll be here to help you make sense of it every step of the way. You know we like to get into the heart of a topic, and with hurricanes Helene and Milton fresh on everyone's minds, we're tackling something close to home for Florida's future. We're diving into a recent NPR interview with a geosciences professor who's living and breathing these changes right there in the thick of it, ready to get into it.
Absolutely. This isn't just about the immediate aftermath. We're talking long-term shifts in the Sunshine State.
And you've got to wonder, 2 major hurricanes back to back. Is this the new normal for Florida?
It's a question on everyone's mind, and this interview really digs into it. This professor, he's not just theorizing, he's seeing the changes firsthand.
Okay, so one of the things that really struck me was this idea of vulnerability having 3 dimensions: exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. Sounds kind of jargony, but
Yeah.
I think it's crucial to grasping what's happening.
It is. It's like a combination lock for disaster. And each of these is a dial we need to consider. First, you've got exposure. More people, more buildings, more stuff in harm's way. Think about Florida's population boom. That's like cranking up the exposure dial.
Right. More folks in hurricane zones equals a higher chance of impact. So what about sensitivity? Is that like how fragile things are when the storm actually hits?
Exactly. We're talking building codes, infrastructure, how tough things are built to withstand a hurricane. The good news is, Florida has been making strides here. They've put some smart adaptation projects in place to soften the blow when these storms do roll through.
Well, they're trying to make things tougher, which makes sense. But then there's this adaptive capacity thing. Sounds kind of vague, I've got to admit.
Think of it like this. Adaptive capacity is your ability to bounce back after the storm, the resources you have, the plans in place to get things up and running. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Florida's population growth means a huge mix of people with hurricane experience. You've got folks who've weathered these storms their whole lives, and then newcomers who might be in for a rude awakening.
It's like experience helps, but a wave of new residents might not be prepared for a true Florida hurricane.
Precisely. And that difference in experience affects everything, from personal preparedness to how the whole community responds. It's not just about riding out the storm, it's about having what you need to rebuild effectively and quickly.
Which brings us to another massive issue the professor brought up. And this one hits everyone's wallets: insurance.
Yeah.
We're hearing about companies flat out refusing to write new policies in Florida, and the ones that are left are jacking up prices like crazy. That's got to be a nightmare for homeowners.
It's a huge warning sign. The professor hinted that these recent hurricanes, especially with Helene and Milton so close together, are going to make the insurance situation even more volatile. They might not even be equipped to handle the sheer volume of claims coming their way.
So,
Yeah.
it's not just the storms themselves, but this ripple effect hitting the insurance industry. That's a whole other layer of impact people are facing. Can Florida really do anything to protect people and property when these monster storms hit? Or is it a losing battle?
It's not all doom and gloom. The professor highlighted some positive steps Florida has been taking. They've been putting resources into projects that reduce flood risk, which is huge in a state like Florida. And they've got programs to help homeowners hurricane-proof their homes, making them more resilient to those powerful winds. So there's definitely proactive work happening. It's not like they're just sitting ducks.
That's encouraging to hear. At least they're not just throwing their hands up in the air. But I have to imagine there's a limit, right? Like with sea levels on the rise and these hurricanes getting even stronger, is there a point where you just can't adapt anymore?
That's the million-dollar question. And the professor made an interesting point. He said there's not necessarily an engineering limit to what we can build. or how high we can build it. The real question is cost versus benefit. At what point does it become too expensive to keep rebuilding and reinforcing against the relentless power of nature?
So some neighborhoods in Florida might be facing some really tough choices in the coming years. Stay and try to adapt, or face the reality that it might be time to move. That's a heady decision to make.
It really is. And it raises questions about responsibility, too. Who bears the cost of adaptation? Individual homeowners, communities, the government. These are complex issues with no easy answers, and they're only going to become more pressing as time goes on.
And then there's the elephant in the room, the one we can't ignore when talking about hurricanes and the future: climate change. The professor seemed frustrated with how both sides of the political aisle are handling this,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to emissions.
Yeah, that frustration came through loud and clear. He talked about how some on the left can alienate people by assuming they're uninformed if they don't agree with certain climate actions. But he also acknowledged the role of misinformation, often coming from the right, which makes having productive conversations and finding common ground nearly impossible.
It's like they're stuck in their own echo chambers, talking past each other. And meanwhile, the hurricanes keep getting stronger and the stakes keep getting higher. What do we do?
That's the frustrating part. This isn't just an academic debate. It's about real lives, real communities at risk. The professor stressed the importance of both adaptation, which we've been discussing, and mitigation. That means tackling the root cause of the problem: greenhouse gas emissions. He emphasized the need for a multi-pronged approach, focusing on things like energy efficiency and renewable energy sources.
So, it's like trying to put out a fire while simultaneously figuring out how to prevent future fires. You have to deal with the immediate threat and work towards stopping things from getting worse in the long run.
Exactly. And that's where things get tricky, because those two things are often intertwined. The choices Florida makes about rebuilding after these hurricanes will have long-term consequences. Are they just going to rebuild what was there before? Or will they take this opportunity to create something more resilient, something more aligned with a future impacted by climate change?
You're talking about designing for the future, not just reacting to the present. That takes foresight and, honestly, a lot of cooperation from everyone involved.
It does. And it's not just a Florida problem, is it? This is playing out in coastal communities around the world. The choices made in the Sunshine State, they could offer valuable lessons for others facing similar challenges.
We're all connected, in a way, but it sounds like Florida is really on the front lines of this battle against increasingly powerful hurricanes and the long-term impacts of a changing climate.
In many ways, yes. And the professor seems to believe that while the situation is serious, it's not hopeless. He emphasized that there's still time to act, to make choices that prioritize both the immediate safety of Floridians and the long-term sustainability of the state.
So where does that leave us? It feels like we've gone way beyond just talking about hurricanes here, you know?
We have. It's like we've zoomed out from these specific hurricanes to see this bigger picture of sustainability, responsibility, the kind of future we're building, not just in Florida, but everywhere.
It's a lot to take in, but in a way that makes you think you know. It's not just about feeling overwhelmed, it's about realizing there's so much more to consider than just the immediate impact of the storm.
That's the power of a deep dive. We started with 2 hurricanes in Florida, and now we're grappling with challenges and choices that face the whole world.
It really highlights how interconnected everything is. But with all these huge issues swirling around, is there any room for hope? What's the takeaway here?
Well, the professor seemed to think that while it's a serious situation, it's not hopeless. He emphasized that there's still time to act, to make choices that protect Floridians now and create a more sustainable future for the state.
So it's about both reacting to what's happening right now
Uh-huh.
and proactively designing the kind of future we want to see.
Exactly. And one of the most fascinating things the professor said was that there's not necessarily an engineering limit to what we can do to adapt. The bigger question is about cost versus benefit.
Yep.
And making tough choices about what we're willing to invest in for the future.
So it's not just about can we adapt, but should we adapt? And where do we draw that line? That's a tough one.
It is tough, and it's something coastal communities around the world are wrestling with right now. The decisions Florida makes in the coming years could offer valuable lessons for everyone else facing these challenges.
Because in a way, we're all in this together, right?
Yeah.
Facing these bigger global issues. But it sounds like Florida is really on the front lines of this fight against climate change and increasingly powerful hurricanes.
They are. And what happens there matters for all of us. It's a reminder that even amidst the destruction, there's still a chance to create a better, more resilient future. It's a call to action for all of us to stay informed, stay engaged, and demand those tough conversations about how we move forward.
Okay, we're about to dive into some seriously choppy waters today, the kind filled with misinformation instead of seaweed. You flagged a ton of stuff about the recent hurricanes, and let me tell you, some of these claims are more unbelievable than a Sharknado.
What's fascinating and concerning is how misinformation seems to surge right alongside those storm surges. People are desperate for information during a crisis, which unfortunately makes them more susceptible to misinformation.
It's like a whole other kind of disaster area. We've got conspiracy theories brewing, misleading claims spreading like wildfire, and even some big names stirring the pot with statements that are, well, let's just say they're raising eyebrows.
One of the most persistent narratives we keep seeing is about the government's response, or lack thereof. There are accusations flying around about aid being mishandled, resources disappearing into thin air, you name it.
Oh, right, like that whole thing about hurricane victims only getting a measly $750. I remember seeing that, and something about it just felt off.
And that's a good instinct to have. This is a prime example of how a snippet of information gets taken out of context and weaponized. While it's true that initial FEMA assistance can seem modest, and $750 is often the starting point, it's crucial to understand that's not the be-all and end-all of disaster relief. We're talking about a multi-stage process.
So it's like getting a Band-Aid when what you really need is a whole medical team.
Exactly. That initial aid is meant to address immediate needs: food, water, temporary shelter. The bulk of long-term recovery funding kicks in later, and it's orders of magnitude larger. We're talking about billions of dollars allocated for rebuilding infrastructure, housing assistance, economic recovery programs, and more.
So comparing that initial $750 to the overall aid package is like saying you climbed Mount Everest because you walked up a flight of stairs.
Precisely. It grossly misrepresents the scope and scale of disaster relief efforts. And unfortunately, that $750 figure has become a talking point used to push certain political agendas.
Speaking of agendas, we can't ignore those wild theories claiming someone's out there steering hurricanes like a joystick. That's straight out of a sci-fi movie.
Ah, yes, the ever-present weather modification conspiracy theories. Now, while it is true that we have technologies like cloud seeding, which can enhance precipitation in very localized areas, the idea that we can control hurricanes to that extent is simply not supported by current scientific understanding.
It's like trying to control a tornado with a hairdryer. The scale of these natural forces is just mind-bogglingly immense.
Precisely. Hurricanes are incredibly complex meteorological events driven by factors like ocean temperatures, atmospheric pressure, and wind patterns. To think we could manipulate these forces with such precision is highly improbable.
But those claims persist, especially in those corners of the internet that love a good conspiracy. And speaking of shadowy forces pulling the strings, we have to address those claims about Project 2025 and its alleged vendetta against essential agencies like FEMA and the National Hurricane Center.
Okay, let's unpack Project 2025 a bit. It's a plan put forth by the Heritage Foundation, a conservative think tank that proposes significant changes to the federal government, including downsizing certain agencies. Now, while the plan does call for restructuring and potential cuts to NOAA, which houses the National Hurricane Center, the idea that they want to outright eliminate these entities is a mischaracterization.
So more like a downsize than a demolition.
Exactly. They're advocating for streamlining, consolidation, potentially shifting some responsibilities. But it's crucial to note that even those proposals are hotly debated. Many experts argue that cutting funding and resources for agencies like NOAA would severely hinder our ability to forecast and respond to hurricanes effectively.
It's like cutting the budget for the fire department during wildfire season.
Exactly. And it's critical to understand those opposing viewpoints because the implications of Project 2025 are potentially huge, particularly for communities most vulnerable to hurricane impacts.
And that's what makes this misinformation so dangerous. It's not just harmless speculation, it has real-world consequences.
Absolutely. When people latch on to these distorted narratives, it can skew their perception of risk, undermine trust in authoritative sources of information, and ultimately make them less prepared when a storm hits.
Okay, so we've got government response narratives being twisted, conspiracy theories swirling around, and politically charged plans with potentially major implications. Where do we even go from here?
Well, it's a bit like navigating a hurricane itself. You need a reliable map and a good compass to stay on course. Let's take another look at some of these specific claims you flagged, because dissecting how they're constructed can help us break them down.
Okay, so I remember seeing a lot of posts about airspace restrictions after the hurricanes, claiming that volunteer drone operators were being grounded and prevented from helping with relief efforts. It felt like the government was saying, no good Samaritans allowed.
Right, and that narrative of the government hindering relief efforts often gains traction during these situations. The reality, as is often the case, is more nuanced. The FAA absolutely does restrict airspace after disasters, but it's not about blocking aid. It's about ensuring safety and coordination in a chaotic environment. Imagine hundreds of aircraft, from military planes and rescue helicopters to private drones, all trying to operate in the same airspace.
Okay, yeah, I can see how that would turn into a recipe for disaster quicker than you can say turbulence.
Exactly. The last thing anyone wants is a midair collision when lives are at stake. So the restrictions are primarily about creating a system, a sort of air traffic control for disaster zones.
So it's not that volunteer drone operators are being shut out, it's more about making sure everyone's coordinated.
Precisely. The FAA has actually streamlined processes for drone operators to get certified for disaster relief. They recognize the immense value these volunteers bring, but it's about integrating them into the response effort safely and efficiently.
It's kind of like instead of everyone rushing into the burning building with good intentions, you have a system to make sure the firefighters can get in and do their job effectively.
A very apt analogy. It's about maximizing impact while minimizing risk, which is crucial in disaster response. Now, shifting gears to another category of misinformation that often crops up, we have to talk about the claims about misappropriation of disaster relief funds.
Oh boy, yeah. I saw a lot of stuff floating around about how money meant for hurricane victims was being funneled into other government programs, particularly those related to immigration. It was almost like a knee-jerk reaction, disaster strikes, and immediately the accusations of mismanaged funds start flying.
It's a recurring theme, and it often preys on people's existing anxieties and distrust. In this case, the narrative seemed to be that funds meant for hurricane recovery were being diverted to support housing for immigrants.
Creating a sense of competition for resources, which is obviously incredibly divisive, especially in the wake of a tragedy.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that government budgeting is incredibly complex. While there's absolutely room for debate and scrutiny about how resources are allocated across different programs, making unfounded accusations of fund diversion only serves to further polarize people when what we really need is unity and cooperation.
It's like trying to solve a problem by creating a whole new problem.
Precisely. Now, it's crucial to note that FEMA has explicitly denied these claims, stating unequivocally that funds designated for hurricane relief are being used for their intended purpose.
Which, if you think about it, makes sense. It's not like there's this big pot of unmarked money labeled disaster relief, use as you see fit.
Yeah,
These funds are usually subject to rigorous oversight and auditing.
absolutely. There are systems in place to track how every dollar is spent, and transparency is paramount to maintaining public trust, especially in these situations.
So it's less about shadowy conspiracies and more about understanding the complexities of disaster response and government funding.
Exactly. And that's where critical thinking becomes essential.
Because we're not just passively consuming information. We're navigating a minefield of misinformation out there.
Well said. And just like navigating a minefield, it requires caution, awareness, and the ability to discern fact from fiction.
So how do we become less like those hapless cartoon characters who wander off cliffs because they're too busy staring at their phones, and more like those savvy explorers who know how to read a map and use a compass?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And luckily, we've got some answers for you right after this short break.
Okay, so we've been tossed around in a hurricane of misinformation.
Yeah.
But you're saying there's a way to navigate this chaos and find solid ground. Give me that compass and map.
You got it. And the best part is these tools are available to everyone. They're called critical thinking and source literacy.
Okay, so less Indiana Jones with a fancy whip, more like librarians with a really good search engine?
Exactly. And it starts with asking the right questions. Who's sharing this information? What's their agenda? What kind of language are they using? Are they sticking to verifiable facts? Or are they trying to stir up emotions with loaded language?
So it's like being a detective at a crime scene. Don't just trust the first eyewitness you meet. Look for evidence, corroborate the stories, and follow the facts wherever they lead.
Precisely. And just like a good detective, you'll want to consult multiple sources. Don't just rely on that one viral tweet or Facebook post. Look for reputable news organizations, scientific journals, government agencies, sources that are committed to accuracy and have a track record of reliable reporting.
Because just because something's trending doesn't make it true. In fact, it's often the juiciest rumors that spread the fastest.
Absolutely. And don't underestimate the power of a good fact check. There are some amazing organizations out there dedicated to debunking misinformation and setting the record straight. Websites like Snopes, PolitiFact, factcheck.org. They're your new best friends.
It's like having a team of Mythbusters on speed dial, ready to tackle any dubious claims that come your way.
Exactly. And remember, it's okay to be skeptical, to approach information with a healthy dose of curiosity and questioning. Don't just accept things at face value, especially when it comes to issues as complex and consequential as hurricane response and disaster relief.
So the next time we encounter a social media feed that looks more like a disaster zone than a news source, what's the takeaway? What's the key to weathering the storm of misinformation?
Be informed, be discerning, and be proactive. Don't let fear and uncertainty make you vulnerable to manipulation. Equip yourself with the tools of critical thinking and source literacy, and remember, sometimes the most heroic thing you can do during a crisis is to stop the spread of misinformation.
That's a powerful thought. So while we can't prevent hurricanes from happening, we can control how we respond to the information and misinformation that swirls around them.
All right, so picture this. You're prepping, like really prepping for a high-stakes meeting, maybe a huge negotiation, right? And the intel, the information you need, the stuff that's got to be rock solid. Turns out it might have been leaked on Telegram.
Not a hypothetical, unfortunately. This is the world we live in now.
It's wild, right? And that's what we're diving into today. Classified documents, Israel's potential plans to strike Iran, and the whole thing just surfaces online.
Out in the open.
Exactly. But to help us break it all down, we've got these excerpts from a recent NPR article. They go into the leak itself, the investigation, the whole 9 yards. You ready to dig in?
Let's do it.
Okay, so first things first. These leaked documents, they seem legit. And they seem to suggest that after Iran's ballistic missile attack, the one back on October 1st, Israel started gearing up for a potential counterstrike. Not exactly the kind of intel you want just floating around the internet.
And this wasn't some random forum. These documents, they were marked as top secret, attributed to the U.S. Geospatial Intelligence Agency, the NSA. Big players. And it ends up on Telegram.
Telegram, of all places. That's the thing that gets me. You've got this incredibly sensitive information shared within the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance.
Right, so we're talking U.S., U.K., Canada, New Zealand, Australia. Top-tier intelligence sharing.
Top tier. And it winds up on a platform known for, well, let's just say a less formal approach to content control. Why Telegram? Is that becoming the go-to for this kind of leak now?
It's definitely a factor. You've got to think about the level of anonymity Telegram offers. It's appealing, especially for this kind of information, because it might be censored through traditional media.
So if you want to leak something sensitive, maybe stay anonymous while you're doing it, Telegram starts to look pretty attractive.
It's a safe bet.
Okay, but how does something this classified even get out? I mean, are we talking about a disgruntled employee? A hack? Something even crazier than that?
The article mentions U.S. officials are looking at all possibilities.
Yeah.
It's a huge deal because it goes way beyond just what the documents say.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you've got potential strain on U.S.-Israel relations, the entire region hanging in the balance. The article even mentioned how the U.S. is urging Israel to cool things down with Lebanon, but Israel's adamant about responding to Iran. It's like a powder keg over there.
And then there's the Five Eyes partnership. This leak basically throws their trust, their whole information sharing system, into question. If something at that level can just appear on Telegram.
What does that even say about security?
Exactly. Can they keep anything secret anymore?
That's quite the ripple effect.
And, this is even the first time. The article brings up the Jack Teixeira case from earlier this year. Leaked classified military documents, but he used Discord.
Different platform, but same basic problem.
Same problem. And I think it highlights something we're seeing more and more of. Open source intelligence, OSINT. Think about it like this. It used to be governments, these intelligence agencies, right? They held all the cards, all the information. But now the internet comes along, you've got your Telegrams, your Discords, and things are different. The playing field, it's leveled out a bit.
Yeah, OSINT, changing the game. But okay, so this leak, this Telegram channel specifically, it wasn't just random, was it? I think the article said it might be linked to Iran somehow?
Yeah, that's where things get even more interesting. See, the channel, it claims to be based in Tehran. And it's got a history, right? Pushing pro-Iranian government content, that kind of thing.
So is it really run from Tehran? Or is that like a cover, a way to throw people off?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It could be a clever smokescreen, sure. But it does make you think. Adds another layer to the whole thing.
It's like a puzzle that keeps changing as you go.
And every time you think you've got a piece in place, it raises even more questions. Is this about, like, controlling the story around a potential conflict?
Yeah.
Sowing chaos,
Hmm.
driving a wedge between allies?
Someone had to benefit from this. Yeah.
You'd think so, but trying to figure out the why in these situations, that's the tricky part. It's rarely ever straightforward, usually a whole bunch of different things at play.
So, motives aside, the information's out there now. We talked about the US and Israel, the Five Eyes thing, but what about the region itself? This can't be good for an already tense situation. Could this make things even worse?
It's definitely a risk. I mean, tensions are high. You've got the possibility of military action. Any wrong move could set things off. But there's also the flip side. Some might say this leak, this very public exposure, could actually work as a deterrent.
Wait, really? How so?
Well, think about it. It puts these alleged plans right out in the open for everyone to see. Any action taken now, it's going to be under a microscope. Huge scrutiny, potential consequences. It forces everyone to be a little more careful, you know?
So, still a powder keg, but maybe like with someone keeping an eye on it now.
Exactly. And that's what makes this so serious. We're not just talking about a leak, an intelligence blip. This is about real-world consequences, peace, and security in a region that's already on edge.
We've been talking about this from the government's perspective, the intelligence angle. But what about the rest of us? Normal people who aren't dealing with top secret stuff every day? How do we make sense of all this? The constant information, the misinformation, leaks everywhere you look. What's the average person supposed to believe?
It's the million-dollar question in the age of information overload, right? Unfortunately, there's no simple answer.
Yeah.
It takes a healthy dose of skepticism, that's for sure. Got to use those critical thinking skills we always talk about.
Question everything.
To a degree. But also, look at where the information's coming from. Who's saying it? What are their biases? Can you find other reputable sources saying the same thing? And this is a big one. Be careful of anything that just confirms what you already believe.
Because that's just feeding the algorithm.
Exactly. There's a lot of noise out there designed to keep us clicking, to keep us outraged. We've got to learn to filter that noise out and find the actual information that matters.
Which is way harder than it sounds.
It is. And this whole thing, this Telegram leak, it just shows how complicated it's become. It's not just about reading a headline anymore. It's about understanding how this information spreads, who's controlling it, and what they get out of it.
So active listening, not just scrolling and scrolling.
It's like you wouldn't just believe anything someone told you on the street without thinking about it, right? Apply that same logic to what you see online, especially when we're talking about something as important as a potential international conflict.
So active listening in this case would mean...
Don't jump to conclusions. Consider everyone's motives, right? And accept that we might never have all the answers.
Which, in a way, isn't necessarily a bad thing.
Exactly. It keeps us engaged, asking questions, and hopefully a little more discerning about the information we choose to trust.
Because it's more than just knowing the facts, right? It's about understanding the context, the different perspectives. It's about how all of that shapes how we see the world around us.
And that's what makes this whole deep dive so fascinating.
It's like we've been saying this whole time, right? We're not just like watching this all happen from the sidelines anymore. The information, where we get it, what we do with it, all of it, it shapes how we see what's happening.
And how we understand, or maybe misunderstand, that can have huge consequences. Look at this leak, the potential impact on peace negotiations, on stability in a really volatile part of the world.
It's huge. So as we're wrapping up here, I keep coming back to this idea of control. Like, who's really in control of the narrative here? Is it the governments, the intelligence agencies, the person who leaked this stuff in the first place, even Telegram itself? Or, and maybe this is me being optimistic, but is there a way for everyday people, you and me, to take some of that control back?
That's the big question now, isn't it? The old rules, they don't really apply anymore, and it feels like we're all just trying to figure it out as we go.
And hopefully learning a thing or two from the mistakes, right? I mean, this whole situation, it really shows you how much things have changed, even in the last few years. Instant information, leaks everywhere, social media narratives spinning out of control. It's a lot.
It is, but it's also what makes this such a fascinating time. That old playbook is gone. So now there's room for new ideas, new ways to approach information, security, how we act as, I don't know, global citizens almost.
It's like we're living in some kind of spy movie, except the stakes are real.
And nobody knows how it ends.
This has definitely given me a lot to think about. It's a good reminder that we're not just watching this all play out. It's on us to stay informed, to really think about the information we see, and to ask ourselves who benefits from us believing it.
Because the truth, well, it's rarely simple. especially in this world, intelligence, international relations. It's messy.
No kidding. So I guess if there's one thing to take away from all of this, from this whole deep dive, it's this. Who controls the narrative? And how much do we really know?
A question worth asking, for sure.
It's a bit of a cliffhanger, I know, but that's the world we're in now. We'll have to wait and see how this plays out. But until then, stay curious, stay informed, and whatever you do, stay skeptical.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Essential Podcast. We really appreciate you listening. Remember to join us tomorrow for fresh insights, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Stay informed, stay curious, and until next time, keep exploring the conversations that matter most.